Before this video starts, just letting you know that I made this video in collaboration with Larrue, rhymes with Bugaboo, the man, the myth, the Digital Tensei. Go check out his video. It's a documentary on Strange Journey that goes over a lot of information. My video, this video, is also part of that video, but frankly, it's so dense with information, you're gonna have to come back later to really get it. Okie doke, that's all. Enjoy the show. Hello all, this is Kid Capes, speaking to you from across the Amala multiverse to bring you some hard-hitting Shin Megami Tensei factuals. Today, we're going to be talking about the leaders of the Chaos faction in Strange Journey. The Mothers. What are they? Where are they? Why are they? But before we can get into all that juicy goodness, we have to talk about the historical and religious basis for these concepts, how they evolved and inspired Strange Journey's lore. The most obvious element at play here is that of the quote-unquote Mother Goddess archetype. It's not exactly easy to give it a simple definition, but they generally share attributes related to sex, fertility, childbirth, or child nurturing. They are also sometimes primordial goddesses, as in, they existed prior to the rest of the universe, or are identified with the earth itself. It has been used to refer to a fairly broad range of deities. Some examples would include Tiamat or Izanami. It should be noted that this archetype is a relic of 19th century academia, which misunderstood the use of the title Mother given to certain goddesses as a reference to fertility and their ability to nurture the young. In truth, both Mother and Father were used as titles given to any head god of a specific area, and it served as a reference to their authority. Similar to how the Abrahamic God was called a father, even prior to the rise of Christianity. And I'm hoping you wouldn't assume that because he's God the Father, that means he's a massive cock or something. Now another major inspiration is the Goddess movement, and that's Goddess with a big G. This is a spiritual movement that gained traction in the 70s, which attempted to combine a series of ancient religious practices from across the world. Naturally, this came with ties to neo-paganism. Their chief claim is that if we look thousands of years ago into prehistoric times, we can assume that many, if not all human societies, had an early form of religion that worshipped a goddess. This goddess is understood to be a deification of the very concept of femininity, possibly having been inspired by ancient man's inability to recognize his place in the reproductive process, in regards to how sperm fertilizes an egg. Since these cults would have been worldwide, this means that the goddess goes by many names, and sometimes has different roles for specific communities. These are sometimes understood to be avatars of the true goddess, though note, not all modern followers of this movement believe that the goddess is a literal supernatural entity. These points are taken even further and argued to be evidence that prehistoric hunter-gatherer societies would have been egalitarian, since women would have special roles as priestesses. This is compounded with the fact that when looking at a hunter-gatherer society, one could assume that for efficiency, they would have stratified gender roles, with women taking up domestic roles with the gathering, while men took up the hunting. In this scenario, in order to track down animals, men would be forced to separate from their community for prolonged periods of time, leading to A, men being detached from the family unit, and B, women having to make the socio-political decisions. This would be what we call a matriarchal society, as opposed to today's patriarchal ones. The death of these societies is believed to have been caused when humanity began conducting large-scale agriculture and practicing animal husbandry. With the shift away from the nomadic lifestyle, men would now have more active and permanent roles in the community. Furthermore, with the advent of civilization comes the rise of basic forms of private property, including slavery and land ownership. This would lead to the foundation of class structures, which previously would not have existed, since everything was owned communally. This would be exacerbated by the conquest of the so-called warlike patriarchal nomadic tribes, which, directly or indirectly, would shatter the culture of matriarchal communities, which are said to be pacifistic and peace-loving. Often included among these warring tribes are the Kurgans, from the Russian steppes, and the ancient Israelites, with Abrahamic religion being the poster child for patriarchal culture. Eventually, these patriarchal social fixtures would totally overtake matriarchal society, but it's believed that its symbols would still be venerated by the goddess's most avid followers, often in secret, similar to how you can see the faint traces of old gods from long-lost pagan religions in modern Christianity. Now you may have noticed, I've used some very specific language like assume and believe in regards to the subject. And frankly, this topic is much too broad for me to discuss in detail, since the real focus of this video is how these concepts relate to Strange Journey, and not their historical accuracy. In Strange Journey then, the concepts manifest in the Chaos alignment, and specifically its leader, Mem Aleph. But before we get into that, we have to explain the metaphysics of Strange Journey. If you're familiar with the series, you'll know that demons are a physical manifestation of human thoughts. Normally, this is kept pretty vague, and was expanded on in a later entry for the series, SMT4 Apocalypse. But in Strange Journey, it's not very clear. So we're going to look to the explanation by scenario writer Shogo Isogai in his interview from the book Strange Journey Schwarzwald Reminiscences. At the root of everything, there is a being called the will of the earth, which is a collection of the thoughts of all intelligent life on the planet. This means two things. First, that it is imperceptible by humans and exists in what Isekai calls the information dimension. And second, that when the thoughts being fed into it change, the will changes with them. Now these thoughts contained within the will exist as crystallized data, meaning that pieces of it represent certain images or symbols. And this data is varied, with some of it having attributes of law and others chaos. Normally, these opposing forces find some sort of equilibrium within the will, but when there's an imbalance, the more prominent symbols can gain the ability to act independently. This can occur when a crisis that jeopardizes the existence of the will itself is caused by the intelligent beings whose thoughts form the will, which in Strange Journey's case is the destruction of the Earth's ecosystem, which will ultimately result in the death of all life on the planet. In response to such a crisis, the will has the ability to activate its internal mechanism for self-preservation and begin to leak into the material world, this being the Schwarzwelt. In Strange Journey, the Schwarzwelt is a physical manifestation of the power of Mem Aleph, leader of the game's Chaos faction and the central symbol of Chaos, which gains sentience apart from the will. This connection between the two is literal in the sense that Mem Aleph did actually create the Schwarzwelt, but also, Mem Aleph herself represents humanity's own chaotic desires. She explains her own motivations like so in the game's Chaos route. I sunk into this land that humans can never know, and watched. All the while, I took in the ideal energy of the creatures of Earth and the humans. But then, destructive energies, giving birth to nothing, began flowing into this land. And as this happened, the Earth began to decay. The Earth can no longer survive without reconstruction. To destroy the Earth is to destroy yourself. We must take the lives of those who have forgotten this and bequeath it to those who have not. So in a sentence, we can understand her and the desires she represents as they return to primitive society, living in harmony with the Earth. But how they do this is destroy pre-existing society, resulting in the death of millions, maybe even billions of people. This is why the sectors of the Schwarzwelt appear as a bitter reflection and critique of the real world. I really want this idea to soak into your heads if you're not familiar with these concepts in relation to the series, so we're going to briefly discuss cycles in SMT. Cycles are a large motif in the series, even referenced in the title, the direct translation being True Goddess Metempsychosis, and this term, metempsychosis, refers to an ancient Greek version of reincarnation. While reincarnation is generally understood to apply to humans, and this certainly does occur this way in the series, an important way this presents itself in SMT is on a planetary level. As in, both the Earth and its populace will have been reborn a series of times. Often, when a major conflict occurs in Shin Megami Tensei, it will not be the first or last time it has or will occur. An easy example of this would be the conception cycle found in Shin Megami Tensei 3 Nocturne, which is basically a system set up by the Great Will so that when a world dies, the humans left alive are able to define a path for the future and shape the new world based on their philosophy. Across the series, this cycle is often used to symbolize humanity's proclivity to shift from extreme ideology to extreme ideology, these represented by the alignments. We can see this clearly in Shin Megami Tensei 4 with Blasted and Infernal Tokyo, which respectively reflect law and chaos. These are both theoretical universes where their conditions directly lead to revolutions led by the characters of the opposing alignment to overthrow these systems. When we observe how this theme presents itself in Strange Journey, we again have to look towards the Schwarzwelt. Now, an interesting thing to note about the Schwarzwelt is that in universe, it's actually not the first time that it's occurred, and this is likewise the case for the human race. In Reminiscence, Isekai talks about a previous race of humans who possessed technology far more advanced than the current ones, but still weren't able to create a sustainable society. Their actions led to the creation of their own Schwarzwelt, and it's mentioned that some of the objects you can see in the game are actually left over from their excursions, including the healing terminals and possibly the moon visible within the Schwarzwelt. So now, we can understand the Schwarzwelt as part of a larger system, a cycle that is on multiple levels perpetuated by the human race, based on their reckless actions, which go against their own well-being, and their subconscious desires. Isekai compares this process to two different things. On a thematic level, he sees this as the results of the human race's accumulated karma. He goes on to describe it in detail by saying, "During the creation process, there was a time when I thought of demons as a liability in human intellectual activities. When humans do something wrong, they accumulate regret and repentance. This accumulation must eventually be paid off, as in, it is a system that brings temperance to human beings, which we tend to forget in our modern world, where everything is forgiven." And this ties into the second way he views the Schwarzwelt, as a sort of planetary homeostasis. Now, I'm sure it's been a minute since most of us took high school biology, so this is its definition given in the Encyclopedia Britannica. Any self-regulating process by which biological systems tend to maintain stability while adjusting to conditions that are optimal for survival. This, obviously relating to how the Schwarzwelt, is basically an internal process used to even out human tendency. This idea was inspired by a real-life ecological hypothesis called the Gaia Principle, which was conceptualized by chemist James Lovelock and microbiologist Lynn Margulis. Lovelock gives a short overview of his hypothesis in his paper Geophysiology, the Science of Gaia. The Gaia hypothesis postulates that the climate and chemical composition of the Earth's surface environment is, and has been, regulated at a state tolerable for the biota. This notion was introduced in 1972 and 1973. The wording of these early papers was sometimes poetic rather than scientific, but Gaia has matured. It might be better stated as a theory that views the evolution of the biota and their material environment as a single, tightly coupled process, with the self-regulation of climate and chemistry as an emergent property. Essentially, Lovelock believed that the Earth should be viewed in the context that all life and the natural processes that occur on the planet work together and form a self-regulating body, which should be thought of similar to that of a living being, and should therefore be called a superorganism. Now, if you're at all familiar with this franchise, you heard me say Gaia, and you probably said to yourself, "Oh, that's a thing I know," I clapped. But for those who aren't, you may know Gaia as the name of the Greek personification of the Earth, the definitive Earth Mother. But that's not really the important bit here. This use of the name Gaia brings to mind Shin Megami Tensei's Cult of Gaia. This group is present in some form throughout most of mainline SMT, and they serve as a series Chaos representatives. They believe human society was corrupted by the god of law, who in a bid for power sealed away many ancient, powerful gods, demonizing them in the process. The ultimate goal of the Cult of Gaia is the revival of these old gods, so humans can return to an era where they lived in tandem with the demons, and in harmony with the earth. This will be a world of survival of the fittest, which they view as a return to man's natural state. I should mention here that Isogai does note that he took care to make differences between Gaianism, as in the cult's religion, and the Gaia philosophy, as in the hypothesis, in relation to Mem Aleph and the Schwarzwelt. But it's interesting to note that in SMT4, when you visit the Tsukiji Hoganji Gaian Temple, there is a giant statue of Mem Aleph visible in the background. Furthermore, when we look closely, we can find parallels between the Schwarzwelt and the setting of Nocturne, the Vortex world. Like the Schwarzwelt, it's explicitly built up to be a realm embodying chaos. At the start of the game, we are shown the Gaian prophecy that foretells the advent of the Vortex world called the Moroku Sutra, which can be seen in the intro for the original and Chronicles editions of Nocturne. Here, it refers to the Vortex world as the Taizo, referring to the Taizokai Mandala, which is essentially a Buddhist metaphor for growth. The thing about this is that Taizo directly translates to womb, and this, along with Nocturne's motif of birth, maps on to SJ's later theme of motherhood, though it's hard to tell how intentional this relation is. If you're interested in hearing me go a little further in depth on Nocturne, check out my video, SMTtheology, Nocturne, Conception in the Womb. And yes, I am plugging it shamelessly. Please subscribe. Now that we've discussed a little about the Earth and birth in the larger context of the series, and specifically Strange Journey, we can start talking directly about Mem Aleph, who is like the linchpin for everything we've discussed so far. First, let's take a look at this quote by writer Nobuyuki Shioda from the SMT 25th anniversary book, Megaten Maniacs, which says, "There is no myth or legend that mentions Mem Aleph by name. It is closer to the universal concept of mother, which is the prototype for the Earth Mother deities of various myths. In many languages around the world, the sound ma often refers to the mother, as in Japan, where the mother is called mama. If you break down ma into the alphabet, you get M and A, and if you call M Mem and A Aleph, you get Mem Aleph. So what we see here is that Mem Aleph doesn't really represent a specific goddess, but more so what we can call the archetypal mother goddess, which is identical to how some in the goddess movement interpret their prehistoric goddess. Furthermore, this view is similar to how Kazuma Kaneko, the series' previous designer, described how he saw the Abrahamic God in a Q&A for a guidebook made for the English release of Nocturne. He says, "There are many mysterious common motifs, like the flood legend in mythology, so I like to investigate mythology from all around the world. For instance, the aforementioned flood legend, the creation process at the beginning of the universe, a hero going on a journey to overcome trials, and sights at the end of the world, etc., etc. It's almost like a shared memory of the events that happened in ancient times has remained to make people draw up the same motifs. One way of thinking is that there was one mythology in the ancient past, and then, as the races moved and the continents drifted, They customized it to the special geography and topography of where they lived, until we got the unique region myths we know today. However, the basis is the same, so even though there are differences in these myths due to geography, topography, and culture, their motif and theme remain very similar. And when I thought about which mythology served as the basis, I concluded that it was the Old Testament. Which means the God of the Old Testament is the basis for all the gods around the world, from a folklorist standpoint. This parallel can be taken further when we consider the Shinto concept of Bunrei and how this has been applied to the Shin Megami Tensei series. Now for a little background, in Shintoism, a god's authority is absolute, in that even when a god is divided, in order for the deity to be enshrined in a new area, the authority that the new shrine holds is equal to that of the original. This newly separated divine spirit that resides in the new shrine is what's called a Bunrei. An easy way to think of this would be in terms of computer data. If you have a file and you copy-paste it to create a duplicate in another folder, it does not lessen the quality of the original. This concept is first overtly seen in the Shin Megami Tensei series in the end of SMT2, the Megiddo arc, and is translated as Avatar. Here, you meet three of Bunrei, Shaddai, Elohim, and Sabaoth, who challenge you for defying the will of the God of Law. These names are all references to titles used for the Abrahamic God in the Bible, and some are arguably different interpretations or versions of him to different people at different times. In Mem Aleth's case, her Bunrei are the other mothers, Ouroboros Maya, Tiamat, and Maya. While Mem Aleth represents an archetypal goddess, these demons represent a localized version of the uppercase G goddess. In Reminiscence, Shogo Isegai explains this as being due to Mem Aleth being a more abstract deity, while the mothers are more concrete and representative of human thought. This also being applicable to the Schwarzwald as a whole. The deeper you go into it, the more foreign to humanity it is. Isegai cites the inspiration for this being what he calls the socialization of deities, which essentially refers to the evolution of religion over time with human civilization, from pantheism to polytheism and monotheism. All of this may explain why, at the end of the game, when you first meet Mem Aleth, humans don't have the ability to perceive her. Now going back to the concept of an archetypal god, this is what we in the business call hyperdiffusionism, which is an anthropological view that many, if not all worldwide cultures, are derived from a single ancient culture. While this is definitely ahistorical, it can lead to some interesting interpretations. For example, Mem Aleth. There are a good amount of details in her design that come together from different cultures to form one cohesive composite figure, and we're going to discuss some of them right now. The most obvious part of her design are the parallels you can find between her and We've already discussed this a bit earlier, but there are other facets, like her gold coloring, the prominence of her head, that she's a creator goddess, and the fact that her name is in Hebrew. But if we're going to go deeper, we need to talk about her name in closer detail. Mem and Aleph are respectively the 13th and first letters of the Hebrew abjad, and are its equivalent for the letters M and A. Side note, abjads are basically just alphabets without vowels. That's why, when you see the tetragram, the 4 letters that make up the name of the Hebrew god, it's YHVH. You're supposed to infer the vowels from that. This example actually ties into the larger point I'm making about Mem Aleph. Unlike how most of us understand letters and words to be largely arbitrary and entirely dependent on the social utility, in Jewish mysticism, also known as Kabbalah, letters are metaphysical, literally acting as the building blocks of reality. This calls to mind Genesis 1:3. Then God said, "Let there be light." And this is not a coincidence. He spoke, and so it was. This line of thought involves a belief of real supernatural power in the mere expression of words. And this was a fairly common religious take across that region, which you can find examples of in the Babylonian Enuma Elish and the Egyptian Book of the Dead. And this is not the only meaning we can take from the name Mem Aleph. If her name can also be read as the letters M-A, and therefore the word Ma, then rather than reading it as shorthand for mother, we can read it in the Japanese context, in which the word Ma actually means demon. It's a shortening of the word Akuma, which is itself derived from the Sanskrit word Mara, the personification of desire that tries to tempt the Buddha and keep him from enlightenment. The word Ma is also used in a Christian sense to refer to the devil. But in short, we can understand Mem Aleph to simultaneously refer to both mother and demon. Another prominent aspect of this design is her pose. This is likely a reference to that of the reclining Buddha, which represents Siddhartha Buddha on his deathbed just before he enters parinirvana. To explain in short, if we understand nirvana as enlightenment in the sense of understanding the true nature of existence and no longer being tethered to the samsara, the cycle of reincarnation, then parinirvana is total separation from the samsara through death, becoming one with the universe. This distinction is important because we have to recognize that while the Buddha are enlightened, they still directly participate in events within the samsara, but this is not the case under Paranirvana. We can actually see this in the game itself as well. In the Chaos route, Mem Aleph sacrifices herself to help pave the way for the player to create the desired world, saying, "I shall disappear, but only for a short while. When the earth has been restored, I will be there." But when you actually achieve the ending, she's not physically present, or at the very least, isn't actually shown. And in the law and neutral endings, when she turns into empty Mem Aleph, she says, "I have become naked power, casting off form, casting off reason, casting off my future. My sole desire is to crush your spirits into atoms, and disappear into the air." So I think we can pretty safely say that in the Chaos ending, she's not referring to being physically present, but spiritually, since this theme appears to be consistent. This theme of enlightenment is also reflected in her third eye. Now you may be vaguely familiar with this concept through pop culture, but it's a symbol that originates in Hinduism as the Ajna chakra, that denotes perception beyond the physical. It may be worth noting that a major figure related to the third eye motif in Hinduism is Shiva, one of the Hindu triumvirate, which collectively work to create, maintain, and destroy the universe. Shiva's specific role is to destroy, but in this context, it's not seen as a bad thing. It's understood as a necessary part of the cycle so the world can be created anew. We can sort of map this onto Mem Aleph's role in the game, since she wants to destroy humanity and force them to evolve so they can live in harmony with the earth. Now that we've discussed the design in more depth, let's backtrack a little bit to the earlier comment by Nobuyuki Shioda. There is no myth or legend that mentions Mem Aleph by name. One may take this to mean that Mem Aleph is Atlas's original character, but that's not actually true. We can trace her back to a book called The Woman's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets by Barbara G. Walker. If you're familiar with Eirikrjs' blog, you may have heard of this before. In this book, Walker promotes a lot of the ideas I discussed earlier regarding the goddess movement, and that by itself would mean it flirts with misinformation, but on top of that, seemed to be entirely fabricated by Walker herself. The sheer volume of just lies leads me to believe that this book actively engages in misdirection and historical revisionism to prove its point. So as you hear me explain the descriptions in this book, I implore you to stay cognizant of the fact that not a single thing I quote from her should be taken as historical. Also, as we go further in this video, I'll be referring to the Women's Encyclopedia as the WE, just so you know. That said, it's still very important to examine its text in the context of Strange Journey, because if there's any single text we can source much of its mythos from regarding the mothers, it's this. We know this because not only is Mem Aleph a creation of Walker, but some of the descriptions given for the mothers in Megaten Maniacs and Reminiscence are very similar to the respective ones from the encyclopedia, and almost word for word in Mem Aleph's case. I say all this to say that we can look at the encyclopedia to try to find a deeper explanation for some of the mythological depictions found in Strange Journey. Consider that some of its quote-unquote mothers aren't even mothers in their own myths, much less mother goddesses. Let's go in order and start with Ouroboros Maya. Traditionally speaking, an Ouroboros is a Greek symbol depicting a snake eating its own tail. It represents infinity, or more specifically, the eternal cycle of life and death, referred to by the Greeks as transmigration. This is due to snakes sometimes being viewed as immortal because of their ability to shed skins. Likewise, serpents have often represented chaos. An obvious example is the serpent from the Garden of Eden that tricked Eve and led to the fall of mankind in the Bible. But another good example is the great serpent Apophis, or Apep, from Egyptian mythology, who stood against the sun god Ra and his servant Seth on their daily journey across the sky. In fact, one of Apep's epithets was world encircler, which is another motif you can see across some world cultures, such as the Norse with the giant serpent Jormungandr, which is said to battle against the gods on the day of Ragnarok. Walker herself relates Ouroboros and Apep in its entry saying, medieval scholars confuse their symbols when trying to uncover the secrets of the Philosopher's Stone. This is a reference to the religion Hermeticism, which has its origins somewhere around 100 CE. It's focused on a figure named Hermes Trismegistus, who was essentially a fusion of the Greek god Hermes and the Egyptian god Thoth. And as early as the Ptolemaic era, the Greeks themselves understood the gods to be equivalent. This relation is made more clear in Ouroboros' own entry, which describes it as the Greek name of the Hermetic world serpent. It is important because it establishes Walker's connection between Ouroboros and the Greek god Hermes, which is relevant in two distinct ways. The first is that this relation to the god Hermes in turn connects us to his mother and member of the Pleiades, Maya. This being why Strange Journey's version of Ouroboros is called Ouroboros Maya. In its entry for serpent, the WE states that the ageless serpent was identified with the great goddess herself. This connection is made clearer in the entry for Maya with an I, which relates the Greek nymph to an unnamed goddess of Maytime festivals, possibly referring to the Roman goddess Flora, and the festival of Floralia, which Walker describes as being centered around a theme of rebirth. Walker also credits Maya for granting Hermes his feminine wisdom, since as her child, he was once part of her, which may play into her takes on Hermeticism that we'll talk about shortly. Now on to the second aspect of this connection, and I think this one is very interesting, because contrary to what you would assume, with Ouroboros' role as a mother, here, the symbol is more specifically identified with Hermes than his mother Maya. In the WE's entry for Hermes, Walker alleges that the Gnostics viewed Hermes as a personification of the world serpent, ruler of time, who coiled around the terrestrial egg, and would go on to directly relate the figures, saying the Gnostics viewed the Druidic Ouroboros as the great snake Hermes. This connection between Hermes and snake imagery is furthered through the Caduceus, Hermes' winged staff encircled by two snakes, and its usage in alchemical circles. We've already discussed in passing the importance that Walker gives the Ouroboros to Hermeticism and therefore alchemy via the Philosopher's Stone. But I want to add that this could also be the mythological basis for a short scene held in Sector E. It shows Ouroboros' powers being maintained by the demons Mandrake, Quancha, Slarhuns, and Basilisk, which respectively call themselves the Child, the Skull, the Frog, and the Dragon. These vaguely resemble the magnum opus, Latin for great work, which is the alchemical process for creating a Philosopher's Stone. It includes 4 stages: Negrito, the blackening, Albedo, the whitening, Citrinitis, the yellowing, and Rubedo, the reddening. That said, I want to be clear here that these stages don't map onto the demons cleanly, and the evidence for this is entirely circumstantial, so this may not be the case. I could be wrong, who knows? If you have any ideas or thoughts on what this might be, leave a comment. Another major element that plays into this is how Walker emphasizes the prevalence of intersexual symbolism, meaning figures with both masculine and feminine sexual characteristics, in its relation to Hermes. Hermaphrodite itself is a word named after the Greek god Hermaphroditus, who Walker also conflates with Hermes. She continues to stress these themes for Hermeticism in Hermes' entry, saying, Hermetic symbolism usually called the serpents male and female, for the real secret of Hermetic power was androgyny. And alchemy in its own entry, referencing the masculine sun, the feminine moon, and the rebus, a figure with overt intersexual themes. Looking at all this information together, my reading of this is that in Strange Journey, Ouroboros Maya is representing something like the intersexual aspect of Hermes, or that the name Ouroboros Maya itself is pointing to how the figure is meant to represent both Maya and Hermes at the same time, like Maya identifying with Hermes or vice versa. If we read this as like a more masculine version of Maya, it would make sense why Ouroboros would be the lowest ranked mother, especially considering that in Maya's WE entry, Walker posits that Maya with an I is essentially a Western version of Maya with a Y, the mother of the historical Buddha, and mentions them as parallel virgins who birth an enlightened one. We're going to talk more about Maya with a Y later in our own section, but I just want to note that maybe we can understand Ouroboros as the lesser, more masculine Maya with an I, while Maya with a Y is strictly feminine. Moving on to the second mother, Tiamat, we find her origins in a Babylonian creation myth, the Enuma Elish. Here, Tiamat is described as the primordial waters of chaos that birthed the first generation of gods, Lamu and Lahamu, with her partner Apsu. In fact, the name Tiamat is believed by scholars to be derived from the Akkadian word Tamtu, meaning sea. Possibly due to this, there is a misconception that Tiamat was understood to be a sea serpent or a dragon, but modern scholarship shows that Tiamat's depiction was largely inconsistent and ranged from literally being a body of water to being a monster with an assortment of animalistic body parts. However, this misunderstanding reflects on not only the aforementioned snake imagery, but also Tiamat's placement in the Drake race of demons. Furthermore, it should be said that Tiamat herself was an invention of the Enuma Elish, and she has a scant presence outside of it. However, there is a very different picture painted by the entry for Tiamat in the WE. We find that Walker erroneously sources the etymology behind Tiamat to Dia Mater, meaning Great Mother, and mentions her as being the single deity who separated the heavens from the earth, citing it as a feat later plagiarized by the ancient Jews, or the Yahwists, who would use it to describe their god. Furthermore, Walker equates the primordial waters to a universal womb, and we can see references to this in Strange Journey itself, when Ouroboros describes humanity as a lamentable mistake birthed by the waters of life, and later, when Mem Aleph describes herself as the mother who lives in the depths of the waters of thought, giving birth to life on earth. Walker also claims that in southern Arabia, the goddess Ishtar took on some of the attributes of Tiamat. And while this may not be inspired by the WE, in Shin Megami Tensei 2, Ishtar is needed to restore the waters of harvest in Bina, and her return allows new demons to be born in the abyss. Bina, in Kabbalistic thought, represents the understanding of God, and together with Hakma, or the wisdom of God, form the Tree of Life's higher union, with Hakma acting as the masculine father and Bina as the feminine mother. Also note that in SMT2, Ishtar's demon race is Lady, but in the Japanese, it's called Jiboshin, which directly translates to Earth Mother. Now what makes all of this so funny is that not only was Walker wrong in the fact that Tiamat was not widely worshipped, not only was the distinct Southern Arabian version of Ishtar a male deity named Ashtar, but also Ishtar is not even seen as a quote-unquote mother goddess in this sense in the first place. It's just a cascade of misinformation. It gets overwhelming sometimes. But regardless, Tiamat herself has a vaguely similar role in Strange Journey, wherein, Sector F, she rebirths the demons Morax, Mitra, Horkos, and Asura into their true forms, Moloch, Mithras, Orcus, and Asherah. Isugai also reflects on Tiamat being a specifically important mother among the three of them, saying, quote, "She took the lead." This may have to do with the fact that between them, Tiamat is the only one who is actually referenced as a mother in her myths of origin, and could be why Tiamat is the mother who is the most motherly, with an army of her demon children surrounding her and serving her every beck and call. Finally, we have the third mother, Maya. The word Maya is taken from Sanskrit and directly translates to illusion or magic. Think like a stage magician. This word actually has a strong meaning in Hindu philosophy. In the Advaita Vedanta school of thought, Maya is the veil that closes humanity's eyes to the Brahman, the true nature of reality, which can only be defined by its infinite and indescribable nature. Furthermore, Advaita Vedanta practices a form of non-dualism, which means that they believe that all of reality is ultimately Brahman. Therefore, belief in any subject being distinct from this whole in any way would be considered Maya. However, as we mentioned earlier in Ouroboros' section, Walker conflates the Hindu concept of Maya with Maya Devi, the mother of the historical Buddha. Now what makes this interesting is that in Strange Journey Reminiscence, this same conflation is made, and they actually go further in detail, saying, "The world we see now appears to be real, but it is an illusion, different from reality, a magical barrier put up by Brahman." Maya wraps us warmly in her bosom, but at the same time, she distracts us from the truth that we should know. That's motherhood. This totally reframes Maya from something negative that keeps humankind trapped within the cycle to something positive. And if you paid attention, you may have noticed that this is actually something Maya herself touches on in the game. She says, "I too once had a dream where humans had a prosperous future. That is because I entered their consciousnesses and brought forth that prosperity. This land of illusions is also the birthplace of the future. But what do the humans show me now? Dreams of decay, rot, destruction. Humans have lost the power in their dreams and can no longer build a beautiful future." Now, I can't tell you what exactly Atlas was trying to go for in twisting his definition, but my take is that in Shin Megami Tensei, chaos generally idealizes change and individualism. This often takes shape in its critiques of law, since it often involves humanity trying to reach some sort of cohesion, creating social stagnancy in order to obtain peace. So if we think about it in this lens, chaos would probably hate the concept of Brahman, since it's an unchanging absolute. However, I do think it's kind of odd to frame Brahman this way, while also using imagery for Paranirvana for Mem Aleph. They seem to have their views on Nirvana clashing. That said, this is more of a nitpick. These figures represent a mesh of human belief, so I don't think they need to represent existing religion exactly. That said, going back to the WE, Walker describes Maya as title of the Virgin Kali as the creatress of earthly appearances, i.e., all things made of matter and perceptible to the senses. So it's possible that they just adapted its usage directly. That said, this entry gives us another interesting tidbit. The use of Kali here refers to the Hindu goddess of destruction and wife of Shiva. Walker describes Kali as the basic archetypal image of the birth and death mother, simultaneously womb and tomb, and claims that the Hindu triumvirate that rules over creation, preservation, and destruction that I spoke of earlier had actually taken over functions that originally belonged to Kali, here invoking the neo-pagan trope, often seen as the maiden or the virgin, the mother, and the crone. This mention of Kali is important because it also helps tie together a lot of the concepts we've already discussed. If you recall, when we talked about Tiamat, I described her as the primordial waters of chaos. Walker relates this to the term tohu wa bohu from Genesis 1:2, meaning formless, describing the state of the earth prior to creation. She claims this to be derived from a quote-unquote general Asiatic belief that the waters of the goddess held all potentiality and was itself tied to the concept of reincarnation cycles. And in Kali's own entry, Tohu wa Bohu is referenced as one of her forms. She goes further to define chaos as the goddess herself in her state of eternal flux, when the fluid of her womb was not yet clotted into the formative state of the solid world. And this is further attested in Kali's entry, when it describes Tohu Wabohu as the primal deep and the menstrual ocean of blood at creation. For me, this brings to mind something Kaneko said in the Nocturne Guide interview I mentioned earlier, where he explained one of the inspirations behind the Vortex world being the Hanya Shingyo, a Buddhist scripture on the nature of emptiness. The Vortex world, as we said earlier, being based around the concept of chaos, which is defined by its malleable nature that is solidified by the will of the reason holder, and even features a cosmic egg in the form of Kagatsuchi. The cosmic egg being a sexual allegory to creation, which Walker describes as mystical symbol of the Creatress, whose world egg contained the universe in embryo. Something worth noting here is to Walker, chaos at large is given roles regarding both birth and death, due to her view of it being the definitive form of the divine feminine. So when we look at her entry for chaos, we see it is also strongly related to that of Doomsday, and the first thing Walker mentions in its entry is to cite its origin to that of the Hindu Kali Yuga. The Kali Yuga is the last stage of 4, during which humanity will be at the peak of its immorality, and is said to end with the fight between the final avatar of Vishnu, Kalki, and the demon Kali, not to be confused with the goddess Kali, though that won't stop Walker. After which, Kalki will eradicate wickedness from the earth, completing the cycle, and the first stage, the Satya Yuga, will begin again. Walker takes this story and interprets the demon Kali as being the goddess, while at the same time merging its narrative role with Kalki's, saying, "Mother turns destroyer, because the race of men become violent and sinful, failing to perceive deity in the feminine principle." When Kali's doomsday arrived, the gods would slay each other, earth would be overwhelmed by fire and flood, the goddess would swallow up everything and unmake it, returning to her primordial state of formless chaos, as she was before creation. All beings would enter her, because she devours all existence. After a time that could not be counted, because even time was destroyed, Kali would give birth to a new universe. With the context we've gained so far, this section serves as a microcosm of the game itself. Here, we can see the influences on the narrative of Strange Journey and how strong the parallels to Mem Aleph are. It simultaneously covers the theme of rebirth, the return to an age of old, the destructive mother, and with it, we can even visualize the Schwarzwald swallowing the earth, and the scarred world that it culminates in the chaos ending. Now, I'll end with this, because I've been talking for a long time. Though Strange Journey gives us a new set of major characters in the form of Mem Aleph and the Mothers, the themes that these figures embody fit neatly within the pre-established lore of the series when looking at elements like the Cult of Gaia in the Vortex world, and they all come together to form a new and interesting take on chaos. If you're interested in these topics, I'm going to have a list of sources with selected reading for you guys to go through, including the book I spoke about at length, The Women's Encyclopedia of Myths and Secrets. And now that I mention it, I want to note that while SMT does have this image of accurately depicting religion, I don't think using faulty sources as an inspiration is necessarily a bad thing, or that Atlas did something wrong for using it, though I do believe they should be more upfront about this when discussing it outside the context of the game. Okay, that's all I got. I'm off my soapbox now. This has been Kid Capes. You can find me at my YouTube channel of the same name, where I do whatever I like. At the moment, it's SMT. I'll hand it back to Larrue now. Thanks for having me.